What's the deal with yaoi? If you're a male fan of anime and manga, or even just a casual observer, you've surely at some point felt a bit puzzled by the immense popularity of stories depicting homosexual relationships between men, usually men that look like girls, that are largely targeted towards young women. After all, it's not immediately obvious what the appeal of romance, and in many cases explicit and graphic activities between two boys is for girls. In an effort to answer that question, I want to do a deep dive into yaoi. I intend to demystify, explain, and deconstruct yaoi for what I assume will be a largely heterosexual male audience, beginning with a discussion of the history and origins of yaoi, and then moving to deconstruct and analyze different perspectives on why yaoi manga appeals so strongly to women in particular. Far before the advent of yaoi, Japan has had a robust history of literature, art, and theater depicting homoeroticism that dates back centuries. Same-sex relations were, at one point, a kind of venerated cultural institution, known as nanshoku or shudo. However, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, attitudes towards homosexuality began to sour as a consequence of the modernization and westernization wrought on by the Meiji Restoration. Inspired by Western sexologists, Meiji-era scholars began to pathologize and stigmatize homosexual relations. That's not to say that no traces of homosexuality in Japanese art and literature survived the Meiji era. For our purposes, the most consequential was the writer Inagaki Taruho, whose works focused on the beautiful boy, or bishonen. Unlike previous writers, Inagaki's work and characters tended to be less stereotypically masculine. In his book, Writing the Love of Boys, Jeffrey Angles describes Inagaki's characters as, quote, gentle, sensitive figures filled with longing, not unlike the beautiful boy characters that are popular in yaoi. He describes how Inagaki's work was able to appeal to women and laid the groundwork for the kinds of shoujo manga and yaoi that would precede him decades later. While works depicting male homosexuality have a significant and storied history within Japanese culture, the development of such works written by and for women is a much more recent occurrence. The origins of yaoi are typically traced to the 1961 novella Koibito Tachi no Mori, or The Lover's Forest, by Morimari. The story depicts a tragic and doomed love affair between a beautiful 19-year-old and an aristocratic, handsome, biracial 30-something-year-old man. Before I continue with the development of yaoi, or stories depicting homosexual relationships between men more generally, this is a good moment to have a quick aside about terminology, namely between Shounen-Ai, boys love, and yaoi. Much of the English language work, particularly those from the early 2000s, tend to use yaoi as a blanket term for Japanese stories focused on male-on-male relationships. Japanese authors seem to more commonly use BL, short for boys love, as a blanket term meaning the same thing. While there's no formal or clear distinction between these terms, this is my understanding of the nuances and differences between yaoi, BL, and Shounen-Ai. Yaoi is actually an ironic, self-deprecating abbreviation of gawanashi, ochinashi, iminashi, translating to roughly no climax, no punchline, and no meaning respectively in English. The term originated from a doujinshi group in the late 1970s. Yaoi works are typically derivative in nature, borrowing characters from existing manga, anime, or video games, and placing their characters in homoerotic situations and relationships with each other, usually in a sexually explicit manner. Interestingly, the term has seemingly become a much more popular moniker in the West, with yaoi generally not being used in Japan to describe male-on-male fiction. The term boys love, or its more popular acronym BL, came about during the 1990s during a quote-unquote gay boom, when media depicting homosexuality became in vogue, particularly in works targeted towards women. BL generally refers to original, commercially published works. In the Japanese context, BL seems to operate as more of a blanket term, encapsulating a wide range of works, both explicit and not, dealing with male-on-male relationships. While Japanese audiences are aware of the term and the history of yaoi, it has largely fallen out of use. In the West, BL and yaoi are used more interchangeably, something that I'll be doing throughout. Finally, Shounen-Ai, literally the love of the young boy, is a term that was originally meant to refer to certain kinds of shoujo manga that emerged during the 1970s, though some in the Western context use the term to refer to stories focused more on romance, in contrast to yaoi, which is more associated with explicit activities. The term was originally meant to refer to a set of manga that revolve around a shonen, or more accurately a bishonen, or beautiful boy, and his struggles with ai, or love. Technically, certain works understood to be Shounen-Ai aren't even, strictly speaking, male on male, which I'll discuss later. Shounen-Ai and manga depicting homosocial and homosexual relations came to prominence during a broader transformation of shoujo manga during the 1970s. Prior to the 1970s, most shoujo manga was created and published by men. Shoujo stories were typically less serious, nuanced, and generally seen as being meant for children. This changed with the advent of works by the Year 24 group, a group of highly influential female shoujo manga artists. So called because they were ostensibly born around the year 24 of the Showa Emperor, or 1949 in the Gregorian calendar. The works of the Year 24 group marked a revolution in shoujo manga, where the stories began to take on a much more serious approach to storytelling and themes, dealing with issues like gender, sexuality, and politics. This is best exemplified by the seminal 1972 manga Barusai no Bara, or The Rose of Versailles by Ikeda Ryoko. Significantly for our purposes, The Rose of Versailles would go on to popularize manga with male-on-male relationships. The next part contains spoilers for The Rose of Versailles, so I guess skip this if you don't want to have a 50-year-old manga series spoiled for you. The Rose of Versailles is, ostensibly, a historical drama retelling the story of French Queen Marie Antoinette in the lead-up and course of the French Revolution. However, Antoinette's role in the manga is quickly eclipsed by that of Oscar Francois de Jarges, a cross-dressed woman who serves as the captain of the royal guard. Despite presenting as male, Oscar never hides her status as a woman, and her sex is an open secret among the characters. The Rose of Versailles was revolutionary at the time for being one of the first shoujo manga to depict a heterosexual romance between equals. Traditionally, romance in shoujo manga tended to revolve around a girl who was depicted as average, unattractive, and unpopular, who is able to find happiness by becoming wholly committed to a relationship with an impossibly beautiful boy who loves her despite her flaws and imperfections. This is the kind of classic Cinderella or Prince Charming story that were dominant in shoujo manga at the time and still recur to this day. What distinguishes The Rose of Versailles from its predecessors is the radically different approach the story takes to romance. Oscar is first paired with the character Rosalie, a kind of stereotypical good girl who admires Oscar's heroism and bravery. That relationship didn't pan out in part because Rosalie was unpopular with readers, despite the fact that Ikeda wrote Rosalie ostensibly to be a self-insert for the reader. Oscar's first foray into heterosexual romance comes of Marie Antoinette's lover Hans Axel von Fersen. Afraid that Fersen only sees her as a comrade and a man, Oscar wears a dress for the first and only time in her life, only to be unsuccessful in convincing Fersen to see her as a woman. Oscar is then arranged into a marriage with the Comte de Giordel. While Fersen only sees Oscar as a man, Giordel only sees Oscar as a woman. Displeased, Oscar goes on to engage in stereotypically masculine behavior, like wearing her military uniform and dancing with women in an attempt to spite Giordel. Oscar's failures in romance with Fersen, who only sees her as a man, and Giordel, who only sees her as a woman, is indicative of how she falls into neither a clearly masculine nor feminine role. After her failed romantic forays, Oscar realizes what the reader has been aware of for quite a while, namely that her true love interest is André Grandier. André originally appears as a servant for House Jarges, and Oscar thinks little of him until he loses his eye in the line of duty. What's interesting is that as André and Oscar's relationship progresses, they increasingly begin to resemble each other in a physical appearance, adopting similar hairstyles and clothing. While Oscar is a woman with decidedly masculine tendencies and traits, André is a man whose masculine identity is compromised. He is of a lower social class to Oscar, and spends much of the story in a subordinate role to her. While Oscar concerns herself with masculine pursuits of politics and her conflicting personal friendship to Antoinette and increasing awareness of the corrupt nature of the Ancien regime, André deals with the stereotypically feminine issue of unrequited love, serving as a point of identification for the female readership. It's not until he loses one eye and gradually loses sight in the other that Oscar begins to see him as a romantic interest. Oscar's disability is symbolic of his loss of masculinity, reinforcing his subordinate position to Oscar, who goes on to fully embrace a romantic relationship with Andre only after he becomes fully blind. Oscar and Andre's relationship is, strictly speaking, heterosexual, but is distinctly portrayed in the narrative as homosocial in nature, both in their physical resemblance to each other, but also symbolically in their positions as a masculine woman and an emasculated man. The Rose of Versailles is, in essence, a kind of Shounen-Ai, despite the fact that the romance is technically between a man and a woman. The Rose of Versailles was tremendously popular with young Japanese women, so popular in fact that when Oscar died, Japanese school teachers were reportedly forced to cancel class as the female students were simply too distraught. It was this immense popularity that would kick off interest in more works featuring explicitly homosexual pairings, such as Hagiomoto's 1974 work Toma no Shinzou, or The Heart of Thomas, or Takamiya Keiko's 1976 work Kaze to Kii no Uta, or The Song of the Wind and the Trees. These early yaoi works, sometimes referred to as Shounen-Ai, share several characteristics that distinguish themselves from modern yaoi or BL stories. Most of the works from this era follow specific genre conventions that were pioneered by Koibito Tachie no Mori. Namely, these works generally feature three things: affluent, typically European settings and characters, beautiful protagonists that are popular with women but nonetheless choose to engage in romance with other men, and finally, these stories typically end in the main character's impossible or perfect love tragically ending with one or both of their deaths. While these stories are ostensibly about homosexual male relationships, these relationships are generally not the primary focus, but rather a part of a broader story exploring the protagonist's search for love, acceptance, and identity. Many of these works contain sexual themes and allusions to sexual activity, but they generally do not portray explicit depictions of sex. Instead, works like The Rose of Versailles feature what are sometimes euphemistically called bed scenes that imply sexual activities between the characters. Over time, these works began to become more adventurous in their depictions of sexual activity, with works like Kaze to Kii no Uta becoming controversial over their more direct illustrations. In 1975, around the same time that works by the year 24 shoujo mangaka were rapidly rising in popularity, the very first comic market, better known as komiketo, komike, or komiket in English, was held. Advances in copying technology, paired with ballooning interest in manga, had encouraged people to create and publish their own doujinshi. While the term is often associated with pornographic material in the Western context, doujinshi is a general term meant to refer to self-published works, often but not limited to manga, fan magazines, or novels. While anime and manga fans are generally thought of to be overwhelmingly men, the early participants and attendants of komiket were almost all young women. By one estimate, 90% of the original 700 komiket attendees were female. To this day, komiket remains an event dominated by women, both among the attendees and vendors. In the early years of komiket, participants were generally young women who were fans of year 24 shoujo mangaka and focused on producing original works. While I focused on the role of the year 24 group in pioneering the depictions of male homosexual relations in their work, many of them wrote and were more popular for traditional shoujo-style stories. By the late 1970s, we start to see doujinshi circles create works with overtly homosexual narratives. One early subject of these homosexual doujinshi were British rock stars like David Bowie, Led Zeppelin, or Queen. This is also when we start to see the focus of doujinshi shift from original works to aniparo, or animation parody. As the name implies, these works focus on placing existing anime characters into novel situations or relationships. These aniparo became predominantly sexual in nature, hence the original coining of yaoi as a contraction for yamanashi, ochinashi, iminashi to describe works without a climax, punchline, or meaning. Interestingly, the term yaoi originally had nothing to do with male-on-male romance in particular. The term apparently originated with members of the lovely doujinshi circle as a description for doujinshi in general. In December 1979, the members of Lovely would eventually go on to publish a compilation of doujinshi focused on male homoerotic narratives, titled Rappori Special Yaoi Issue, which seems to have effectively narrowed the meaning of yaoi to works depicting homoerotic male relationships. While yaoi has become the term most vividly associated with anime and manga depicting homosexual relationships, the term would take several years to take off as the dominant term for describing male and male romance, competing with terms like Shounen-Ai, Tanbi, or June, referencing the June magazine, which was the first commercially published work focused on male homosexuality. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Shounen-Ai published by professional shoujo mangaka started to slowly fade away. June, originally Comic Jun, served as something as a bridge between commercial yaoi, principally coming from professional shoujo artists, to increasingly being spearheaded by amateur, fan-driven works. For our purposes, June had two major ramifications for yaoi. First, June expanded the aesthetic and narrative sensibilities of yaoi beyond what had been pioneered by the Year 24 shoujo mangaka. Second, June also expanded the scope of participation for professional and up-and-coming mangaka to everyday fans. June featured ads for amateur-published doujinshi and doujinshi circles looking to recruit members. The magazine also featured an editorial policy permitting unsolicited manuscript submissions, which encouraged women to produce and share works amongst themselves. By the early to mid-1980s, yaoi anipado started to rapidly take off in popularity, largely eclipsing original narratives as the primary site of male homoerotic stories. The football manga Captain Tsubasa, published from 1981 to 1988 in the famous Shonen Jump, became the first manga to reach mass popularity among yaoi doujinshi circles, with parodies of Captain Tsubasa dominating the halls of Komiket for several years during the early to mid-1980s. In the subsequent years, other Shonen Jump manga like Saint Seiya, Slam Dunk, Prince of Tennis, Naruto, and One Piece would all go on to prove quite popular subjects in homoerotic anipado. The rise of yaoi anipado in Japan parallels quite well the development of slash fiction in the English-speaking world. Starting in the 1970s, Western writers, almost exclusively women, started writing homoerotic fanfiction pairing Kirk and Spock from Star Trek. The major difference between Japanese enjoyment of yaoi and Western slash fiction is scale. Until fairly recently, slash fiction, or works explicitly focused on homosexual relations, have remained contained to fairly niche fan communities in the West. You would never, for instance, see entire bookstores dedicated to selling homoerotic fiction, or entire aisles of Barnes & Nobles dedicated to such stories either. The rise of yaoi anipado in the 1980s kicked off an exponential boom of interest in homoerotic material. By one estimate, commercial boys' love and yaoi manga had a core readership of roughly 500,000. A decade later, that figure would double to over 1 million. During the 1990s, a large number of BL periodicals started to crop up. By the mid-90s, something like 30 different BL magazines had come into existence. Bookstores had also begun setting aside dedicated space for BL fiction. The most vivid evidence of yaoi's rise to prominence could be seen in the transformation of the area around Ikebukuro Station into what's now known as Otome Road, an area littered with shops and stores catering to yaoi fans. The emergence and widespread adoption of the internet throughout the 90s and early 2000s helped to fuel further interest in yaoi. One of the most prominent examples of this is with Axis Power's Italia. Originally published as a webcomic in 2003, the series would rapidly balloon in popularity, earning over 20 million hits in just a few short years, and would go on to become one of the most popular manga series of the late 2000s and early 2010s, buoyed in large part by the story's large popularity with yaoi fans. As an extremely scientific marker of popularity, Italia has 118,000 stories on fanfiction.net, behind only Inuyasha and Naruto. By the 2000s, there was an increasing popular awareness of how widespread BL fandom and readership was becoming amongst young women, particularly in works depicting anime and manga subculture. We started to see depictions of yaoi fangirls. One of the earliest and most prominent examples of this was the 2006 webcomic Tonari no Yaoi-chan, which depicts a romantic relationship between a male otaku and a yaoi fangirl who quite literally transforms into a green monster whenever she sees beautiful boys. Yaoi fangirls are also depicted in works like Genshiken and Lucky Star, which are explicitly targeted towards otaku and focus on discussions of otaku subculture. The effects of BL fandom have also had major impacts on quote-unquote mainstream anime fandom, with the term yaoi bait or fujoshi bait used to refer to generally low-quality shows or manga that are seemingly created with the intent of pandering to yaoi fans. I think the moment of realization for myself, and perhaps many other male anime fans at the time, of the scale of BL fandom was in Kyoto Animation, a studio that, up until that point, had come to prominence for otaku works like The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya or Lucky Star, and moe works like K-On! Adapted free. While the show is largely forgotten today, I remember the gay swimming anime being quite a big deal when it came out in the early 2010s, nor can we forget the widespread popularity of Yuri on Ice, or gay ice skating. In recent years, we also see yaoi and BL becoming a global phenomenon, especially in Asian countries. BL fiction, known as danmei in China, has rapidly taken off despite the fact that pornography and media depicting homosexuality is illegal in China. BL has also seen a similar rise in popularity in countries like Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Much like Japan, international audiences for yaoi and BL are primarily young women. The globalization of BL has, itself, spawned significant academic attention, and probably deserves an investigation all to itself. Now we come to the question that this entire piece has been building towards. Why exactly is BL so popular, particularly with heterosexual women? One reading is to simply dismiss this entire line of questioning as trite. After all, no one seems to question why lesbian porn is very popular among men, but the massive popularity of BL has spawned numerous investigations into the rationale behind its widespread readership. For starters, the reasons behind why yaoi became so popular in Japan and why it became so popular with international audiences are likely quite different. For one, conventional wisdom suggests that Japanese yaoi fans are predominantly heterosexual women. From what I can tell, this remains largely true, but there are constituencies of LGBTQ women or even men that they consume BL content. The limited research on Chinese danmei fans seems to more or less mirror assumptions of Japanese BL fans, with the majority being heterosexual women. In the English-speaking world, this assumption that BL fans are mostly heterosexual women seems much more dubious. One survey of the yaoi fan site Aaron Fantasy found that heterosexual women made up less than half of the sample. A 2013 study of users of Archive of Our Own, a fanfiction site that skews heavily towards female readers and male-on-male pairings, found that only around a third of the respondents identified as heterosexual. A 2023 study of roughly 5,000 AO3 users found that only 14% of respondents identified as heterosexual, suggesting that heterosexual women make up an increasingly small portion of the English male-on-male romance audience. The difference in identification between Asian BL fans and Anglophone ones is likely a result of cultural differences that I will discuss later. The most obvious Occam's razor explanation for yaoi's popularity is that women find yaoi to be sexually arousing, and that BL acts as autoerotic pornography for women. Indeed, this rationale seems to be supported by survey data of yaoi fans. Analysis of BL, especially in comparison to explicit doujinshi for men, finds that BL tends to have a greater focus on the pleasure of both parties involved. Thus, BL places more emphasis on the romantic attraction between partners, which might help to explain why BL serves what one scholar called the, quote, autonomous female pleasure-seeking impulse, end quote. However, yaoi and yaoi fans have become the subject of great interest by academics, whose work I'll attempt to summarize here. While yaoi's initial rise to prominence during the 1970s and 1980s was largely ignored by academics, by the 1990s the phenomenon was so widespread that it became the subject of interest among Japanese and non-Japanese scholars alike. Early work tended to focus on psychoanalytic analysis of yaoi as the avenue for understanding yaoi's popularity with young women. Essentially, early work on the popularity of yaoi argued that it was a medium for women to escape patriarchal and hegemonic norms of femininity. Read this way, BL is meant to be understood less as being about male-on-male relationships, but as a kind of neutral, non-gendered space for women to explore their sexuality in ways that diverge from societal expectations. The feminist sociologist Ueno Chizuko argued that the beautiful boys that appear in BL are meant to be neither male nor female, but rather represent a kind of third sex that women can project into and engage in kinds of imagined perfect relationships. This is a point also argued by the sociologist Kazuko Suzuki. In her analysis of BL, she argues that the genre allows women to escape Confucian norms of female sexuality being wholly limited to childbirth. In her 1998 essay, Pornography or Therapy, Japanese Girls Creating the Yaoi Phenomenon, she writes, quote, "Abandonment of the female body via the depiction of male homosexual relations emerges as the result of disappointment with a society characterized by sexual oppression." The theory that BL provides women a way to escape from traditional norms of femininity is reinforced in analysis of Chinese yaoi writers and fans. A 2020 study of Chinese yaoi writers argues that the production of yaoi in China is a kind of digital feminist counterculture that seeks to fight against Confucian gender norms pushed by the Chinese Communist Party. Despite extensive state censorship, online yaoi spaces serve as a site for a kind of feminist resistance that allows Chinese women to escape binary gender norms. A 2010 survey of Taiwanese yaoi fans produces similar responses to the Chinese cohort, with respondents saying that they are drawn to yaoi by the ability to challenge social taboos and such or experience freedom from gender constraints. This psychoanalytical approach to yaoi helps to explain why demographics of yaoi readers are so different in East Asia versus in the West. We believe that yaoi serves as a way for women to escape from the negative aspects of femininity. This explains why a comparatively smaller portion of the Western yaoi fanbase identify as heterosexual women. Women in Western countries, broadly speaking, have more autonomy, and Western countries are generally less sexist, so the impetus to use yaoi fiction to escape negative gender stereotypes and expectations is less pronounced. This also might help to explain why Western yaoi readers are more likely to identify as sexual minorities, as those groups tend to have greater feelings of societal alienation. Since the 2000s, the psychoanalytical framework for understanding yaoi fandom has come under scrutiny by others who argue that simply viewing yaoi as a way to escape from the societal demands and expectations of womanhood are incomplete. The sociologist Kaneda Junko criticized these early approaches as pathologizing BL fans and perpetuating stereotypes of Japanese women as psychologically vulnerable and weak. Instead, Kaneda argues that analysis of BL fandom should instead focus on how female readers derive entertainment and pleasure from their engagement with BL texts. Deborah Shamoon, in her book Passionate Friendship, argues that BL stories provide a safe space for girls and young women to explore their sexuality and relationships with boys. She explains how works like Toma no Shinzou or The Rose of Versailles profoundly shaped how women saw sex and relationships, with readers expressing their enjoyment of an idealized romantic love between equals, one that they presumably could not access in works depicting heterosexual romance, where the woman is often depicted as passive and dependent on their male partner. Much of the analysis of yaoi fandom is limited by the fact that most studies are conducted by analyzing BL texts themselves and drawing conclusions about readers indirectly, rather than through direct interaction or observation of yaoi fans themselves. This is a limitation that Patrick Galbraith sought to rectify in his research that examines the way that Japanese yaoi fangirls, or fujoshi, communicate with each other, and how that communication serves a, quote, pleasure-oriented way of enjoying BL. Fujoshi, the Japanese term for female fans of BL and yaoi, is a play on words that turns the term for women into a homonym for rotten girl. Fujoshi are considered rotted because their preference for fictional male-on-male relationships deviate from the expected social role of women in Japan. The term originated as a pejorative, but has since been reclaimed as a descriptive way for BL fans to identify themselves, with many women embracing the label to distinguish themselves from normies or ippanjin. Through his interactions and observations of fujoshi, Galbraith argues that what defines fujoshi is their appreciation of moe, an effective response or desire and attachment to fictional representations. He writes, quote, "In pursuit of moe, the fujoshi interacts with fiction, other people, and the world differently. Essentially, fujoshi are attracted to the fiction and fantasy of the male-on-male relationships in BL, and it's precisely because those relationships are divorced from reality that makes BL so appealing to fujoshi. One of the women Galbraith spoke to identified as a lesbian, and obviously had no attraction to real men, gay or straight, despite her deep interest in fictional men. Another woman described how she would imagine her boyfriend in situations of other men, despite the fact that he had no interest in men, nor did she want her boyfriend to have relations, sexual or otherwise, with men. Galbraith describes how fujoshi engage in moe talk, or moe banashi, where they discuss the moe aspects of different characters, couplings, and situations. Consider one of the most common examples of moe talk, namely determining which character is the seme, or top, and which one is the uke, or bottom. On the surface, it seems rather bizarre to discuss male homosexual sex in such a blasé manner, not unlike how one might discuss handbags or clothes. But fujoshi are not describing themselves or real people, but rather discussing the moe points of different characters. Moe talk provides fujoshi the ability to engage in what Galbraith terms transgressive intimacy, where moe is, quote, used to empathetically express deep, personal, intimate, and even transgressive emotions in networks of mutual exposure and vulnerability, end quote. By engaging in the fantasy of discussing risque topics of BL, fujoshi are able to identify and form strong bonds with each other, helping to explain why women and BL doujinshi circles continue to dominate komiket. Read this way, fujoshi are not unlike otaku, who are generally understood to be mostly male. While fujoshi are marginalized for their perverse and deviant interest in fictional men and male-on-male relationships, otaku are marginalized for their similar attraction to fictional girls. While otaku can turn animals, machines, and even historical figures into cute girls to trigger moe, fujoshi are able to turn everything about the beautiful boy into a side for moe as well. Galbraith recounts one example where the fujoshi he observed were able to read a yaoi coupling into the Great Wave at Kanagawa, a woodblock print with no obvious yaoi undertones. Fujoshi and otaku operate with similar preferences for fictional contexts, a preference that exists precisely because these fictional contexts are divorced from reality. Much like how male otaku build databases of moe elements based on fictional girls they covet, creating different constitutions of archetypes like the kudere, yandere, or tsundere, fujoshi do a similar thing through their constant variations and reconstitution of the seme-uke relationship, with the seme and uke being associated with different traits and characteristics. Essentially, the appeal of BL is not merely escaping from the negative aspects of femininity, but BL and moe talk provide women with a positive space to explore imagination and sexual desire with one another. From what I can find, comparatively little research exists on the motivation of Western yaoi fans, and even less discusses male fans of yaoi, called fudanshi or rotten boys in Japan. One 2018 study used what they deemed the yaoi consumption motives questionnaire to empirically analyze the motivations behind yaoi readership among English-speaking fans. The most important motivator behind yaoi consumption were generally that respondents found yaoi sexually arousing, female-oriented, different from traditional romance, and that yaoi allows for self-identification with the characters and stories. Escapism and yaoi's promotion of non-gendered or pro-homosexual narratives also scored highly, particularly for respondents who did not identify as heterosexual. This survey suggests that motivations for yaoi consumption are multifaceted, encompassing a variety of reasons, including escapism, sexual gratification, or engagement with moe. Now that I've produced something like 5,000 words on the history and analysis of yaoi, I find myself wondering, what was even the point of this exercise? Other than for my own, and the audience's edification, of course. What strikes me is the degree to which the history of the female-dominated yaoi industry and audience are deeply intertwined and parallel the development of the stereotypically male otaku culture. Both yaoi and modern otaku culture were the outgrowths of the revolution in shoujo manga in the 1970s, with yaoi fans latching on to the male-on-male romance legacy of the Year 24 group, while otaku focused on the beautiful girl characters descended from shoujo manga. Komiket, one of the quintessential icons of Japanese anime manga fandom, owes its existence in large part to female BL fans. Both male otaku and female fujoshi graduate to media that society deems unacceptable as a way to escape the hegemonic pressures of Japanese society. While otaku are denigrated as failed men who are obsessed with fictional girls because they cannot get together with real women, fujoshi are labeled as rotten girls because their similar perverse interests defy traditional expectations of womanhood. Both otaku and fujoshi demonstrate an intense preference for fiction. Their preference for cute girls and beautiful boys respectively are not because they resemble real people or situations in any way, but it's precisely their fictional nature that makes them so powerful. While I'm not going to go out and read BL myself, I certainly have more respect for BL and BL fans after all this research and analysis.